Welcome back, everybody. So, we are going to continue our beginner series today on learning how to play chess. What we're going to be talking about next are two unique situations. These are special moves that can occur in the game. We're going to be going over castling as well as en passant. So, when do these things occur? Well, we're actually going to go through a little game here, a little mock game, and show a couple instances of how we can use castling and when en passant might occur. Let's go ahead and start out with a few simple standard normal opening moves here. We've got e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to c6. This would be something along the lines of a Ruy Lopez with bishop to b5. Now, what you'll notice here is with this last move, white has two open squares now between his king and his rook. The pieces in between are now totally gone. Let's say that black plays a move like d6 here. What white can do here is make a move that we call castling. Castling is a great way to keep your king safe. One of the most important things in the opening is going to be our king safety. This is something that we'll talk about in another video yet to come on opening principles, things we should be looking for at the start. And one of the best ways to keep that king safe is to castle it. So how do we do that? When we castle, we're going to move the king. Now typically the king moves one square at a time, but when we castle, it actually is going to move two here. It's going to come from e1 all the way over to g1. When that happens, the rook is also going to move as well. It's going to come from h1 over to f1. This move can only be made when there's empty squares in between the king and the rook. A couple other important rules to note on castling. The king is not allowed to castle if it's in check. So if the king is under attack from an opponent's piece, then you cannot castle. If the king is going to castle into check, for example, if black were attacking the g1 square here, white also can't castle in that scenario. That makes sense. We already know that the king can't move into check, so of course on that. But the last one, which is another unique one, is that the king cannot castle through check as well. So let's show an instance of what that might look like. Play a couple maybe silly looking moves here just to give you the idea. And oh no, white's blundered and let black take his bishop. Well, of course you can recapture the bishop here with his knight, but one thing you'll notice is that this bishop now eyes the f1 square. Because the bishop is attacking f1, the king is not allowed to castle, because going to g1 would mean that he's castling through check. So in order to castle, you cannot castle out of, through, or into check. Furthermore, you have to make sure that it's the first move of both your king and the rook. You cannot castle if your king has already moved or if your rook has already moved. Even if you make two moves, maybe this turn you play rook g1 and next turn you play rook back to h1, and then you want to castle, you still can't do that. It has to be the first move for both your king and your rook. So white goes ahead and gets rid of the bishop here. Black moves his piece. White gets out of the attack. And now, what you'll notice here is black also has open space between his king and the rook on the other side. So when we castle, not only can we go on the king side, we can also castle on the queen side. Here in this instance, there's three squares between the king and the rook, whereas over here there's two. So how do we do this? Well, regardless of whether you're castling king side or queen side, the king will always move two squares. This is the important thing to remember. When you castle, the king moves two squares, and the rook will go to the other side. So here's what that's going to look like. The king castles over, the rook is now on d8. And if white castles, two squares as well, he's on g1, the rook's on f1. So black has castled successfully to the queen side, and white has castled successfully to the king side. Now let's go ahead and make a couple more moves on our board over here, just for the sake of showing our next concept. We've talked about castling a little bit. And now what we're going to talk about is en passant. So castling was that special move that the kings and the rooks can do. En passant is a special move of the pawns. Now, we all know that the pawns capture diagonally. They can only move one square up the board at the time, with the exception being on their first move. So right now, for example, if black were to play the move b6, white could capture on b6. He could play a takes b6 and capture that pawn. But if black plays the move b5 and moves 2 squares forward, it seems as though white wouldn't be able to take, right? He's now passed. Pawns don't capture sideways, they capture diagonally. Well, this is where en passant comes into play. When chess was first begun, pawns didn't have this special option. They weren't allowed, actually, to move 2 squares on the first move. It was a later advent that was added to the game, and which stuck on and people liked, and that's the way that we play chess now today. However, because of this, they decided to allow for a special move that says, hey, you know what, since you can do this whole 2 moves, 2 squares forward on the first move of the pawn, it's not really fair that I don't get the chance to capture you. You go straight from being stuck to straight to being on the other side of me. So what you're allowed to do here is, if your opponent just moved 2 squares forward, and only if he just did it, so if his last move was to move 2 squares forward with the pawn, you're actually allowed to capture behind the pawn. You can play a takes b6. Let's go ahead and take a look at that again. Black plays a move b5. He's run past the white pawn. Haha, I snuck away. Well, it doesn't matter. White can still play a takes b6. This is captures en passant. Now, one important thing to note here is, let's say black plays b5 and white does not choose to capture immediately. Maybe he plays, I don't know, something different, b4 right away. Black plays another move, and now white says, oh, I forgot about en passant. I want to try it on this turn. I want to play a takes b6. Now you're not allowed to do it. It's an illegal move. You can only capture en passant on that first turn. So the very first time black plays b5, you'd be allowed to sneak in and make en passant. Otherwise, you cannot do it after. So that's castling, and that's en passant. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below. Be happy to explain any of these in further detail as we're going through. Hopefully this will get you on the road to victory, keep those kings safe, get those pawns active, and get you where you want to be in your games.